I would like to take most of remaining time this week to talk about my recent publication in ecological economics. This paper concentrates on biodiversity loss, and as you may remember from a few minutes ago, the rate of biodiversity loss is thought to exceed the planetary boundary. The planetary boundary for biodiversity loss is captured by the extinction rate, which is expressed in number of extinctions per million of species years. The pre-industrial value is thought to lie between 0.1 and 1, where a recent publication by Pim et al. Argues that the background extinction rate is likely to be closer to 0.1 than 1. Rockström et al. Propose a planetary boundary of 10 extinctions per million species years, and describe that the current extinction rate exceeds at least 100 extinctions per million species years. More recently, Stefan et al. Proposed to add a zone of uncertainty around the initial planetary boundaries. For biodiversity loss, they propose that this zone of uncertainty runs from the earlier 10 extinctions per million species years to 100, meaning that biodiversity loss is thought to exceed the planetary boundary beyond uncertainty. Reductions in biodiversity impair global carrying capacity through reduced ecosystem efficiency and resilience, increased risk of infectious disease, and for many, lower immaterial value. See, for example, Cardinale et al. On ecosystem efficiency. As a general rule, reductions in the number of genes, species, and functional groups of organisms reduce the efficiency by which whole communities capture biologically essential resources, nutrients, water, light, prey, and convert those resources into biomass. Next, I quote Rockström et al. On ecosystem stability. Ecosystems that depend on a few or single species for critical functions are vulnerable to disturbances such as disease and at a greater risk of tipping into undesired states. Reductions in biodiversity impair global carrying capacity through increased risk of infectious disease. Here I quote Casing et al. In recent years, a consistent picture has emerged. Biodiversity loss tends to increase pathogen transmission and disease incidence. Option value refers to the potential future value of leaving resources unused, and several have argued that this option value is likely to be increasing over time because new technologies or unknown diseases may open up new uses for the biological compounds that we continue to discover. See Crutella for another reason why people have argued that the option value of national parks and such are likely to be increasing. Immaterial value is also referred to as intrinsic value or existence value. That is, I may simply put value in the knowledge that there still exists 3 kangaroos, although I may never get to see them. Finally, see Chapin et al. And Constanza et al. For examples of the importance of biodiversity for ecosystem services and the valuation of these services, respectively. This paper contributes by exploring regional variation in expected biodiversity loss across 538 terrestrial regions and 19 oceanic regions, covering most of global surface, using the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species data. Subsequently, I explore how expected biodiversity loss correlates with human population density and GDP per capita data. Let me introduce the dataset quickly. The paper uses the second version of 2016 data of the IUCN Red List that contains over 80,000 species assessments. Each assessment falls into one of the following categories, ranked from most frequent to least. Least concern, 47%, data deficient, 16%, vulnerable, 14%, endangered, 9%, near threatened, 6%, critically endangered, also 6%, extinct, 1%, lower risk or conservation dependent or extinct in the wild. The categories vulnerable and endangered and critically endangered are in bold because together they make up the threatened category, which I use as one of the dependent variables. Also, for these three categories, one of 5 sufficiency criteria specifies an extinction probability that I use to calculate the number of expected extinctions for my extinction rate measure under assumptions that I will spell out soon. The data set, its coverage is nearly complete for mammals, is extensive for birds, is decent for amphibians and reptiles, but is less extensive for plants and insects. Most of the assessments are carried out by the IUCN Species Survival Commission, and all assessments are reviewed by a member from the Red List authority on the relevant taxonomic group. Close to 70% of species has been reassessed after 2010. I calculate the earlier mentioned extinction rate measure for 557 regions and matched data on population density and GDP per capita, leaving 489 regions for analysis. The difference is due to the exclusion of oceanic regions, uninhabited islands, and a few regions without GDP per capita information. For the remaining 489 regions, I have obtained estimates for the population density and GDP per capita from the World Bank, UN, CIA Factbook, EU, and various national statistics agencies. See the appendix of the paper for the details. Now a few words on how I construct my extinction rate measure. The threatened categories each have 5 sufficiency criteria based on population numbers, habitat range, extinction risk, or combinations of these. For example, critically endangered species meet 1. A population size estimated to number fewer than 50 mature individuals. One of 3 other criteria that you can consult in the IUCN 2012 publication, or 5. Probability of extinction in the wild of at least 50% within 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is the longer. For endangered and vulnerable species, this last criterion reads 20% and 10% within 20 or 100 years or 5 generations. To calculate the expected extinction rates for the coming century, I make several simplifying assumptions. First, I consider only species that were labeled as ones native to the region. Although I refer to regional estimates, I base my estimates on global extinction risk. For example, the giant panda, which is assessed as vulnerable and regionally extinct in Hunan, contributes to the extinction rate of Hunan because it is labeled as ones native to the region. This preempts a critique to my analysis that I find a biased relation between extinction rates and population density or GDP per capita, because most vulnerable species have already disappeared from populous or wealthy regions. See Cardillo et al. 2005 for this argument. Next, I assume that the 50%, 20%, 10% are valid estimates for critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable species for the coming century. In this, I make no distinction between short-lived and long-lived species. And for critically endangered species, I basically assume that if the species survives the decade, it also survives the century, rather than assuming that when it survives the decade that it will face unchanged survival probabilities for the next, etc. The latter assumption would approximately double the extinction rates that I calculated, and means that virtually no critically endangered species will see the end of the century. Finally, once I have calculated the number of expected extinctions from heightened extinction risks, I add the number of expected extinctions from the background rate and express this total relative to the expected background extinctions. To calculate the regional number of expected background extinctions, I take the number of assessments in the region minus data deficient and extinct assessments and multiply this with the 1 extinction per million species years upper bound estimate from Rockström et al. Let me illustrate the measure with an example from the state Puebla in Mexico. The IUCN dataset had 220 assessments for Puebla, of which 3 critically endangered, 17 endangered, and 19 vulnerable species. The pictures give you some idea of how widespread this threat of extinction is. That is, the endangered category included 2 crawfish species, 3 amphibians, 2 pine trees, 5 cacti, 3 bumblebees, and a mammal. On the next slide, we see that the number of background extinctions is only 0.02, and that combined with the number of threatened species from the last slide, this gives an expected extinction rate for the coming century that is 330 times the background rate. Note that this way the extinction rate measure can range between 1 and 5001. When I made these calculations for all regions and got creative with my coloring pencils, the following map emerged. You can observe the 17 regions that have expected extinction rates within planetary boundaries in a dark green color. You may need to look well, since these regions represent only 2.6% of assessed land surface. Those regions that stay within the zone of uncertainty for biodiversity loss are depicted in light green and yellow. Together, this concerns 192 regions, making up 46.2% of assessed land surface. The remaining regions, a little over half of the assessed land area, transgresses the planetary boundaries beyond doubt. The average region's extinction rate is 189, while the global extinction rate I obtain under assumptions spelled out earlier is 759. I will get back to this discrepancy towards the end of this lecture. For now, let me point out that we seem to observe the highest extinction rates on islands and tropical regions. For this reason, the analysis will include a number of control variables, such as an island dummy and subcontinental dummies. The analysis consists of ordinary least squares regressions, OLS in short, of percentage threatened and locked extinction rate on locked population density, locked GDP per capita, and the earlier mentioned controls. Before jumping to the results, let me briefly recap what we do with OLS and why I take locked values. In OLS, we are looking for a linear relationship between variables that fits the data best. What OLS does is it fits several lines through the data. For each line, the program calculates the distance between the observations and, let's say, the predicted extinction rates, and squares this distance. Subsequently, it sums all squared distances to the candidate line and picks the line which has the lowest squared errors. That OLS squares errors before finding the minimum is the reason for taking logarithms of the extinction rates, the population density and GDP per capita. These variables have a large positive skew, meaning that there are relatively fat tails, or put differently, relatively many observations with large values, and to prevent that these observations would receive extra weight in the OLS minimization problem, I take logarithms of their values first, bringing the log distribution closer to the ideal normal distribution that is required for OLS to give unbiased estimates. The reason for using OLS regressions is that it allows us to look for associations between variables while keeping others fixed. By including continental dummies, I obtain estimates for the relation between extinction rates and GDP data that cannot be explained by continental differences. In other words, the estimation uses subcontinental variation in GDP and extinction rates. Let me point out that due to taking logarithms, the coefficient for the extinction rates are elasticities rather than the usual slope parameters. Here we can see the results from the OLS regressions. In panel A, for the percentage of assessments that are labeled as either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, and in panel B for the extinction rate. The top figure gives the estimated coefficient, the second the standard error of the estimate, and the third gives the standardized coefficient. We can see that both population density and GDP per capita have positive associations with the extinction rate. These results are robust when including additional controls for weather conditions in the region's capital, temperature and annual rainfalls specifically. Let me present two examples to get some sense on the magnitude of these estimates. The expected increase in the population from 7 billion to 10 billion mid-century would be associated with a 7% higher extinction rate and a doubling of GDP per capita with an 8% higher extinction rate. And although I cannot make causal claims, to put these figures in perspective, for the current sample species, an 8% higher expected extinction rate would give 416 additional extinctions during the coming century, while the past millennium we recorded 923 extinctions. I interpret these findings as being illustrative of absolute scarcity becoming binding in many locations. When thinking about alternative explanations, one candidate explanation that first comes to mind is that there may be something in the assessment procedure that could explain my results. That is, richer or more densely populated regions may have better means for assessment and therefore have fewer data deficient assessments, or more rare species that are difficult to identify. Yet, in the paper I also show that these estimates are basically unaffected by controlling for the number of species assessed or the number of data deficient species. Now it may be that you can think of an alternative explanation, and I'm happy to hear more of those in class. For now, let me point out some peculiarities when it comes to my map. First, I promised that I would address the difference between the average region's extinction and the global extinction rate. The reason is that species of least conservation concern have larger ranges. And while they count only once towards the global extinction rate, they occur in multiple regions, pushing average region's extinction rate down. And consequently, the much higher global extinction rate cannot be read from this map. Second, it may be good to point out that the extinction rates are not the same as conservation priorities. In terms of the library metaphor in Weizmann's Noah's Ark problem, the expected extinction rates could be considered a state of a library, but not the number of books in the library, which would be species richness, or their distinctiveness, i.e. species isolation in a phylogenetic tree. To determine how and where our conservation dollars are best spent, we would need more information on the current distribution of threats given conservation infrastructure such as protected areas and the like. In short, this paper showed that extinction rates are positively associated with population density and GDP per capita. The results suggest that battling poverty through economic growth comes at an ecological cost. For redistribution, this is less clearly so. This may also be a good moment to point out that a serious effort to preserve biodiversity goes beyond establishing protected areas. For example, climate change has contributed to amphibian extinctions and may lead to the collapse of corals. See Pounds et al. And Freeler et al. Respectively.